So when we picture the natural world, we usually we imagine this perfectly narrated documentary in our heads.
Oh, definitely. Like the dominant alpha male standing proudly on a rock.
Right. The strict, unyielding pecking order of the pack and this, relentless, clear-cut drive to just survive and reproduce. It's a very clean story.
It is. It's incredibly easy to digest.
But when you actually look at what animals and humans, for that matter, do when they think no one is watching, that neat little script just goes completely out the window.
It really does. The behavioral landscape we're looking at is, well, it's profoundly messy.
Yeah, messy, beautifully complex, and honestly entirely shocking if you're stuck in that old mindset. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in today's deep dive. We're looking at the hidden social architectures of the natural world.
And we have a really fascinating stack of sources to get through today.
We do. We're going to look at a longitudinal study of Semini forager horticulturalists. In the Bolivian Amazon, we've got the censored, honestly bizarre logs of an early 20th century Antarctic explorer, and we'll dig into these groundbreaking papers on the evolutionary role of same-sex behavior across the entire animal kingdom.
The main goal today is to uncover how our deeply ingrained human biases have essentially blinded us, like really blinded us to the true complexity of social and sexual bonds.
Exactly. For you listening, by the time we get through this deep dive, you'll understand why concepts like a simple pecking order or basic mating instinct are just woefully inadequate for describing both human politics and animal survival.
It's highly structured and deeply comforting to imagine nature operating like a rigid corporation, mostly because it mirrors how we historically like to organize our own human societies. But the data just dismantles that illusion.
Right. And I think we have to start with ourselves, humans.
Yeah.
Because if there is one biological trope that simply refuses to die, it's the idea of the alpha male.
Oh, absolutely. The big brute who rules by sheer physical force.
Yeah, exactly. But the research on the Tsimane people of Bolivia offers a totally different reality. We're looking at this fascinating study by Daniel Redhead and Christopher von Ruden. They spent years mapping the social networks of Tsimane men, and what they found about how power and coalitions are actually formed has almost nothing to do with who can punch the hardest.
The underlying mechanisms of their social hierarchy are really what make this study so compelling. Because the Tsimane live in relatively egalitarian communities in the Amazon. They don't have formal police forces.
Right. No courts. Conflict resolution is entirely informal.
Exactly. So the obvious question is, in a society without formal authority, how do you actually gain influence? The researchers found it relies heavily on a mathematical and social concept called transitivity.
Transitivity.
Yeah. Simply put, the ally of my ally is highly likely to become my ally.
It's essentially advanced networking. Like, when I was reading this, it immediately reminded me of building connections on LinkedIn, but, with much higher survival stakes.
That's a great way to think about it. You don't build a massive, reliable survival network by yelling at people or intimidating them.
Right. You build it by being the indispensable hub that connects different groups. The study showed that these men build coalitions through reciprocity, and more specifically, through the consistent sharing of food and labor.
And that sharing translates into a very specific kind of status. The highest status Tsimane men aren't acting like dictators demanding tribute. They earn their position by acting as mediators.
Mediators, yeah.
Like if two families are having a dispute over crops or hunting territories, the high status man steps in, calms things down, and maybe shares meat from a recent hunt to, smooth over the tension.
Which builds prestige, and that is fundamentally different from dominance.
Completely different. Dominance is fear-based deference. People listen to you because they're afraid of the consequences, but prestige is freely conferred respect.
Wow.
The researchers noted that while physically formidable men might have some early advantages in youth, long-term status was overwhelmingly tied to this complex web of social sharing and conflict mediation.
Hearing this, I feel like I've been lied to by, every pop science article I've ever read.
A lot of people feel that way.
Right, because if our own human hierarchies are actually this nuanced and so deeply dependent on cooperation and prestige, why are we so obsessed with projecting the alpha brute caveman narrative onto ourselves and onto nature?
Well, we project that narrative because we have historically viewed the entire natural world through the lens of our own contemporary cultural anxieties. We expected to see aggressive dominance because that justified our own societal structures at the time. And when early scientists observed behaviors in nature that violated their strict moral codes, they didn't just ignore them. They actively hid them.
Which brings us to the penguins. We have to talk about the penguins.
There is perhaps no greater or more bizarre example of this exact cultural panic than what happened on Captain Scott's Antarctic expedition in 1910.
Right, with Dr. George Murray Levick. He was a medical officer and scientist on that famous expedition, and he was the very first person to study an entire breeding cycle of the Adélie penguin.
Levick was a very traditional, highly educated Edwardian gentleman. He goes to Antarctica, endures absolute misery, survives blizzards, and eventually has to weather an entire winter in an ice cave subsisting on seal blubber.
Just horrible conditions.
Unimaginable. But the thing that truly broke his spirit wasn't the freezing temperatures. It was the sexual behavior of the penguins.
He literally recorded witnessing what he called astonishing depravity.
Astonishing depravity.
Yeah, he saw male penguins engaging in sex with other males. He saw intense sexual coercion. He even saw them attempting to mate with dead penguins.
And he blamed this on rogue factions of what he called hooligan males.
Hooligan males. But the wild part isn't the behavior itself, it's the lengths he went to in order to keep it a secret. He literally coded his scientific field notes.
He did. He used a self-invented system of Hellenized English. He substituted Greek letters for English ones based on visual similarity. So, for instance, using a Greek gamma to stand in for a G.
That's insane dedication to censorship.
He encrypted his raw data so that only educated gentlemen could decode the horrors he believed he was witnessing. The idea was that uneducated sailors or the general public needed to be protected from this information, lest it, corrupt their morals.
And the scientific establishment completely backed him up on this. When he finally returned to England, the British Museum published his paper on the penguins, but entirely censored all the sexual behavior to preserve public decency.
Yep. Those specific observations were printed in a private pamphlet and buried in an archive for nearly a century.
But if we look at the modern biological context for these Adélie penguins, it's not depravity at all.
No, not at all. It's biology operating under extreme, agonizing constraints. Adélie penguins live in one of the harshest environments on the planet.
Yeah.
And they have this remarkably tiny breeding window in October. The ice is melting, the predators are circling, and the young adults have almost zero experience. So because of this intense pressure, they are responding to highly specific visual cues rather than engaging in complex psychological decision-making.
Right, the visual triggers just misfire.
Exactly. For example, a dead penguin lying flat on the ice with its eyes half open looks incredibly similar to a compliant female assuming a receptive mating posture.
Oh, wow.
So it's not necrophilia in a human psychological sense. It's inexperienced, highly stressed birds reacting to inappropriate but biologically confusing stimuli. Their neurobiology is basically screaming at them to reproduce right now, and the physical cues get crossed.
Okay, but if Levick was a highly trained scientist, how does his Edwardian cultural bias so completely override his fundamental objectivity? I mean, you would think a scientist's primary directive is just to record the data, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes them feel.
Well, science is a human institution, and scientists carry the baggage of their era. Levick wasn't an isolated case. For over a century, the entire apparatus of the scientific method was skewed to filter out behaviors that didn't fit a strict heterosexual reproductive model.
Right. And this phenomenon actually has a name in the literature, doesn't it? Ethographic erasure.
Yes, ethographic erasure. And to understand it, you have to know what an ethogram is.
The ethogram is basically the standard catalog of behaviors that field researchers use when they're observing animals in the wild. It's like their checklist.
And those checklists were built with a profound structural bias. If a researcher in the field saw two male monkeys mounting each other, the standard ethogram simply didn't have a category for same-sex sexual behavior.
So what did they do?
They had to creatively relabel it. They would categorize it as a dominance display or a mechanism for tension relief, or they just lump it under sociosexual behavior.
Anything but actual sex.
Exactly. They went to astonishing lengths to avoid calling it sexual desire, even when the exact same physical behavior between a male and a female was immediately, unquestionably coded as sex.
It's basically like wearing these blue-blocking glasses out into the world, looking around, and then, publishing a peer-reviewed paper claiming that the color blue doesn't exist anywhere in nature.
That's a perfect analogy. You've literally engineered your observational tools to guarantee you won't see it.
And this went all the way to the top. The sources mention a 1979 U.S. government report on killer whales where the editors actively deleted mentions of homosexual behavior before allowing it to go to publication.
They did. And the paradigm didn't really begin to shift until 1999, when Bruce Bagmill published his book, Biological Exuberance.
Such a great title.
It really is. And that book shattered what biologists called the scarcity model. That's this incredibly rigid utilitarian idea that every single animal behavior must be strictly functional, purely reproductive, or dictated by mere day-to-day survival.
Biological exuberance is just the perfect phrase for it. And the statistics pulled from Baghil's work and the subsequent field studies are just staggering. We aren't talking about rare, isolated anomalies here.
No, it's everywhere.
Look at giraffes. Up to 94% of observed sexual encounters in giraffes are male-male. 94%. And it's not just aggressive fighting. The necking behavior involves gentle rubbing and deep social bonding.
Or consider bottlenose dolphins.
Oh.
They engage in complex group encounters that researchers colloquially call wuzzles.
Wuzzles.
Yeah, wuzzles. These are giant, fluid social events where they use acoustic foreplay, specifically genital buzzing with their sonar, to build and solidify long-term alliances.
That is wild.
Then you have the Laysan albatrosses in Hawaii, where researchers discovered that up to 31% of nesting pairs are actually two females co-parenting.
31%. That's a huge portion of the population.
It is. They form deep bonds, they divide the labor of hunting and incubating, and they are incredibly successful at raising chicks together.
Okay, so the behavior is ubiquitous across birds, mammals, and marine life. And this is the big question, walk me through the evolutionary math here. Because evolution is notoriously ruthless. Natural selection is like a brutally efficient accountant. If a specific behavior doesn't ultimately create offspring, how does it survive the evolutionary chopping block over millions of years?
And that exact friction is what evolutionary biologists dubbed the Darwinian paradox.
Once the scientific community finally admitted that same-sex behavior was a widespread reality, they had to figure out how the genes driving it weren't aggressively bred out of existence.
Right.
One of the leading frameworks they developed to solve this is the kin selection hypothesis.
Which is the super uncle theory, right?
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of intuitive sense. To understand the mechanics of it, the sources highlight a study by Paul Vossi and Doug Vanderlaan, published by the Association for Psychological Science.
Yeah, the study on the Fa'afafine people of Samoa. Exactly. In Samoan culture, the Fa'afafine are a historically recognized third gender. They are biological males who are attracted to adult men and often assume feminine social roles within the community.
And what the researchers found was that the Fa'afafine display extraordinary levels of altruism toward their nieces and nephews. They consistently pay for medical care, they pay for schooling, they tutor them in art and music, and they provide substantial child care.
Which fundamentally shifts the genetic equation.
It does. Because under the rules of kin selection, if you aren't having your own direct children, you can still ensure your genetic lineage survives by investing heavily in your close relatives.
Right, because you share about 25% of your DNA with your nieces and nephews.
Exactly. By acting as these super uncles, the Fa'afafine ensure their relatives not only survive, but thrive in their environment. Therefore, they are passing on shared family genes, which would theoretically include the genetic predispositions for same-sex attraction.
Now, just a pause here for you listening. It's worth noting that applying evolutionary models to human sexuality creates a lot of friction today.
Oh, a massive amount of friction.
Yeah. On one side, you have strict creationist frameworks that view any same-sex behavior as a deviation from biological design. And on the flip side, you have groups who take this animal and evolutionary data to sort of naturalize human behavior and argue for modern social policies.
Right. And just to be totally clear, our goal today isn't to weigh in on modern politics or validate a specific social movement or endorse either ideological side. We are simply tracing the biological mechanisms proposed in the research and showing how science attempts to explain these widespread observations.
Exactly. Impartiality is key here. And, getting back to those biological mechanisms, I actually see a massive limitation with the kin selection theory. Yeah, I mean, the super uncle theory makes perfect mathematical sense for highly social, intelligent humans in Samoa. They have complex family structures. But what about insects? Does a fruit fly really care about putting its nieces and nephews through fruit fly medical school?
Probably not.
Right. Or a nematode? There has to be a broader explanation because this behavior is documented in species that have absolutely zero family structure or post-birth parental investment.
And that limitation is exactly what pushed evolutionary biology toward its current cutting-edge paradigm shift. In 2019, a groundbreaking paper was published in Nature Ecology and Evolution by Julia Monk and her colleagues at Yale.
This paper completely flips the script.
It does. They argue that for 100 years, the entire field of evolutionary biology has been asking the completely wrong question.
Instead of asking, why does same-sex behavior exist, they decided to ask, why not?
Yes. They proposed what they call the ancestral condition null hypothesis. The traditional, unquestioned assumption was that exclusive heterosexuality was the original primitive baseline for all animals, and that same-sex behavior evolved much later as some special, costly derived trait.
But Monk and her team flipped that entirely.
They hypothesized that indiscriminate mating with members of any sex was actually the baseline for all early sexually reproducing animals.
Let's look at the actual cost-benefit analysis of that, because the logic is just brilliant. If you are an early, primitive organism crawling around in the primordial ocean, the absolute worst thing you can do, evolutionarily speaking, is miss a chance to mate.
It's the ultimate failure.
Right. The cost of missing out is catastrophic. Your genetic line ends right there. But the cost of imperfect sex discrimination, meaning you accidentally expend energy trying to mate with the same sex, is incredibly low. You just waste a few calories in a couple of minutes.
So evolution didn't aggressively select for same-sex behavior. It just didn't heavily select against it. The penalty was minuscule compared to the massive reward of being highly sexually proactive.
That makes so much sense.
From this perspective, the real evolutionary innovation wasn't heterosexuality. The true innovation was the much later evolution of traits that allowed for discrimination, like bright plumage, highly specific scents, or complex mating calls.
It's a lot like a survivalist fisherman. Like if you are starving, you don't sit on the dock with a single, highly specific fishing pole waiting for the perfect specific species of fish to bite.
No, you'd starve.
Exactly. You cast a massive wide net. It's an insurance policy. You're going to pull up some seaweed, maybe an old boot, and plenty of things you can't use, but you absolutely guarantee that you won't starve. Indiscriminate mating is basically the biological equivalent of casting a wide genetic net.
And when you look closely at the physiology and genetics of animals today, you see profound evidence of just how deeply encoded and fluid these ancestral behaviors still are.
Give me an example.
Take the whiptail lizards of the American Southwest. They are an entirely female species.
Entirely female?
Yes. They reproduce through parthenogenesis, which essentially means they clone themselves without male fertilization. But they still must engage in pseudocopulation. One female has to mount another and act out the physical male role.
Wait, so if they are just cloning themselves, why do they need to mimic mating at all? Like, what is actually happening inside the lizard to make that necessary?
It's all about the neurobiology.
Yeah.
The brain still requires the physical sensory stimulation of the mating act to trigger the endocrine system. The mounting behavior causes a surge in hormones that signals the ovaries to actually release the eggs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the behavioral software for both male and female mating acts is still fully intact and functional in an animal that hasn't had males in its population for generations.
And we see it at the genetic level, too. The sources highlight the FUCM gene in mice. This single gene helps regulate estrogen levels in the developing brain, which in turn alters how the olfactory bulb processes pheromones.
Right.
And if you delete this one specific gene, female mice will completely ignore the scent of males and actively seek out female mates. The capacity for all of these behaviors isn't some rare mutation. It's baked right into the fundamental genetic code, just waiting to be expressed depending on the environmental or genetic triggers.
It really is.
Which completely reframes the whole picture for you as a listener. I mean, we started our journey today in the Bolivian Amazon, discovering that Simini tribesmen build their status not by dominating others through fear, but by sharing food, building coalitions, and mediating peace.
A completely different kind of alpha.
Exactly. And then we traveled to the freezing Antarctic to see how our own cultural blindness forced a Victorian scientist to encode the reality of nature in Greek letters. We watched evolutionary biology tie itself in knots, searching for a Darwinian paradox, only to finally realize that the exuberant fluid web of connections from co-parenting albatrosses to all-female whiptail lizards isn't a glitch in the system.
No, it's the original design.
Right. The natural world is not a rigid binary hierarchy of fear and strict utilitarian reproduction. It's wildly adaptable.
Which leaves us with a lingering question. If we spent the last century missing the true, complex nature of animal and human social bonds simply because we viewed them through the lens of our own historical anxieties, what other fundamental natural behaviors are we currently misinterpreting because of the modern biases we hold today?